Hi, and welcome to the Exponential Europe podcast. My name is Jason Lim. We as Exponential are a community with a cause. We want to see reproduction and multiplication become the norm in the behavior and language of the church in Europe again. I am your host for this podcast. This is our second episode. I'm the American-sounding German that looks kind of like a Chinese guy. So a confusing experience to people. And I'm sitting here in London this time around.
Because everything that you just said will be seen by those listening to the podcast.
Exactly.
So they won't have a clue of that.
Yeah. When they see me, they'll be even more confused. So I'm sitting here with the wonderful Cris Rogers. And already this has been quite the experience because we walked into your study. We're greeted by R2-D2 in life size that you can actually drive around. Mandalorian helmets, Star Wars, all around, including ectoplasm and some other great stuff. So already there's much to dive into. Then we walked through the darkness of your wonderful church building, not to interrupt the group meeting that's going on there right now. With
the Russian recovery meeting.
Right, the Russian...
That is, they're drug addicts, they're Russian speaking, the whole meeting is in Russian. Welcome to London.
Welcome to London, exactly. So Cris Rogers, what would you say are the most important things we need to know about you?
Oh, I don't know.
So there's already some...
What question? I actually don't know how to answer that, genuinely. I don't know what
How would you introduce yourself, would you say?
So I am a church planter
here
in East London. Me and my wife moved to this church in 2010. It was a church that was going to be sold to become a mosque. East London Mosque wanted to buy it, the largest mosque in London, wanted to buy the church. And luckily, the day the proposal went to the Bishop of London, I showed up with a friend of mine and we said we would love to look at taking over this church, congregation of 7, and saying, look, could we go there and try and revitalise this church? And
Did you know about the situation already, or did you just happen?
Yeah, so I'd actually looked at doing a church plant in South London. I was all set. We were praying. We really felt like the Lord said, we want you to a poor neighbourhood and we want you to go and revitalise or plant a church. So that's what we felt. We thought we were going to Croydon, which is south of London, south of Thames. I had a building, I had a house, I had a wage.
Wow.
And then I went to see, I'm Anglican, so I went to see the bishop. And the bishop said, we don't do church planting here.
Where was this?
This was in 2009.
Oh, things have changed.
Changed a lot. So I came away from that and said, look, Lord, I think the call is right, but obviously that's not the right place to be. Made a contact with a friend of mine from Holy Trinity Brompton, HTB, the Alpha course. Said, look, this is what we're thinking. Do you know of a church that you think is interesting for us to look at in terms of planting? It has to be in a neighbourhood with high deprivation. And he put me in contact with a guy called Rick Thorpe, who's now Bishop Rick.
So he wasn't bishop then?
He was not bishop then, he was just Rick. And he's heavily involved with Exponential and done a lot with Exponential. And Rick said, look, I know a church down the road. We've talked to 7 different church leaders about planting there. Nobody will go there because it's 65% Bengali. And people have gone, they've been intimidated and they've left. So I then are already thinking, that sounds great. We came in the January, my wife and I, to visit the neighbourhood. It was rainy, it was grey. There was a condom on the church doorstep and there was an injecting needle. And I thought, gosh, she's not gonna go with this. And she turned to me, she said, I hate it. But this is where God's called us to be.
Oh, wow.
Now, the thing is, once you move somewhere, you get a very different picture. And now she doesn't say, I hate it. And she looks back thinking, actually, it was a rainy day. And there was a condom on the doorstep. There was just elements of it that did. Yeah. But actually...
But it's better to decide to do it when you see that and realize... Instead of the other way around, when you think it's a sunny day, it's a beautiful, there's flowers everywhere, and you bump into the condom later on.
Exactly. We then went to see the bishop, and we sat down. I had a business plan, I had a strategy, and thoughts on how we would revitalise this church, how we would plant into it, and I didn't need any of it. I walked in, and he opened his file of facts and said, "When do you want to start?" And that was it. Picked a date. and then that was it. We had 4 months to plan, and a month before we moved, we still didn't have a home.
Wow.
And there's a house that you just visited that's attached to the church.
Oh, it didn't come with the church.
It had not been used by any church leader in 25 years. There'd not been a full-time priest here for that long, and others were using the home. And at that time, it was being used by 5 young men who were running a business from the house called Wazzle Limited. They made porn movies in the house. They had an online business where they sold sex toys and outfits. They were growing marijuana in the garden, and they were paying good rent, really good rent. And we were told, you can't have the house because it's making £4,500 a month. It was like the rent was, but it's, I mean, the house, you've seen the size of it. It's got 5 toilets, so you can see how it would be rentable. And it was about a month before we moved, and the bishop just said, "This is ridiculous. You get them the house." So 4 weeks before we moved, the guys in the house were told that they had to move on.
Oh no!
And they did move on, but they moved on in such a way that they just walked out of the house. The carpets were ruined, the walls were ruined, everything about it. My first piece of mail was a French-made costume, which I still have to this day. I can't fit in it, but one day my dream is that I will, and it'll be a sermon illustration.
There you go.
But yeah, I mean, they before we moved in, the Church of England came and set the marijuana in the garden on fire, which is just the cracker's idea. But we saw the house 2 weeks before we moved, and then. So
where were you already in London?
We were in West London. I was working for a church that was predominantly working with teenagers. So it was a church that aimed to reach a generation the church often don't reach. Mm-hmm. And we had somewhere in the region of 120 to 140 young people that were attached to our church. But one of the issues for me was I wanted to reach young people that was on this estate, council-owned properties. You know, US talk about them as projects. So council-owned, high deprivation, and I wanted to reach that neighbourhood, and I was told by the church, we don't do that. We're working with these kids over here that come from middle-class families. Yeah. And that for me was just that's great. It works, but that's not for me anymore. Mm-hmm. So we'd been there 5 years, and I was the teaching pastor of the church, and I just thought, it's time to move on. And sometimes you think, is it right for me to change this church, or is it right for me to move on and let somebody else take on the vision that is here? Because as a church leader, sometimes you can battle with a church that actually is not yours to battle with anymore. Yeah. So we moved, and I've not looked back. This is our 15th year here. So if you say, what's the highlights? There's so many. We've planted 2 churches from us. We're looking at planting a 3rd one next year. We've grown many church leaders. People have gone on to do some form of training for ordained ministry. Many lay leaders who've gone on to do some form of lay work in the church, either a youth worker or a worship pastor. We got given in 2012 a building about 2 minutes walk from here that was built post-war. It was a community centre that was created to serve the poor of the neighbourhood. A lady in 1904 started the project. The building got bombed in the war. They built her a new building, and it served the elderly of the neighbourhood when I arrived. And we were just praying over it, that God would revitalise this incredible work, but that we'd get more involved. And I got a phone call from the trustees saying, actually, the local vicar has a position on the board. Do you want to join? I joined. And then a year later, all the staff resigned. They just said, this is not viable. This neighbourhood is only 1% over 65 and white. It's 2% over 65 and Bengali. And they were trying to reach white people rather than anyone. So it was never going to be viable. They all resigned, and that was in September. And then I got another phone call from the trustees saying, we've had a conversation behind your back. We would love to offer the building to the church. Would you come and run the ministry from this building?
Wow.
The deal is, though, that you need to eradicate poverty. That's what the building exists for. Could you come and eradicate poverty? And the question was, well, can we do that and tell people about Jesus? Because if we can't, then actually we're not here to do social action.
Right, we are a church.
And Rupert said, that's the expectation. That's the expectation. And I didn't know at the time that Rupert was originally from Holy Trinity Brompton, and his grandma had served in the centre. So he'd kept that really quiet from me. But he knew the church were the ones that needed to drive us. So we've had that building now 10 years. We served 700 individuals.
So the charity's no longer there.
The charity is there.
Oh,
they maintain the building.
Okay.
But we do the work.
But who owns it?
They own it.
I'll still own it.
And they run it. They basically maintain.
Wow.
They pay heating.
But they just give you the space for you to...
Exactly. We don't pay a thing.
That's wonderful.
And we run it for them every day. We are the people on the door. And 700 individuals last year through food pantry, ESOL classes, children work, family work, domestic violence support. That's all that work that we do there. 90% of the people we serve are Bengali, so they speak Sylheti. Many don't even speak English. So we've been learning some Sylheti, so Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
And just trying to work out how do we communicate well with people, so we show real kingdom hospitality, that we want to be part of their life, not just expecting them to learn English. Yeah. So we do all of that work from the centre, so God gave us that. We then were praying that we would make a difference in recovery work. We'd been trying to do some recovery work. We were getting nowhere. And we were just saying, Lord, lead us to someone who will be able to pioneer some recovery work for us. And a phone call came in from a guy, and he said, I run a ministry near Bristol, and we work with recovering addicts. And I've got some friends who want to start a recovery ministry in East London, but I can't find a church that would be happy for these addicts to come and be a part of their church and run this ministry. And he's trying to do the hard sell with me on the phone. And I thought, I ain't got time for this hard sell.
Yeah.
And it was exactly what we've been praying for.
Right.
I said, look, can I just pause you there?
Yeah.
The answer's yes.
Yeah.
When can I meet them? And I think from what he said, he'd emailed 50, 60 churches, had no response. He'd called about 7 or 8, and people were saying, no, we don't really want that at our church. I was the only one that said, hang on, stop talking. Yes, we're praying for this. So in 2017, I met with a guy called Ralph. He'd only been a Christian a very short period of time. And we started a gathering in the church called Father's House that it's half church and it's half recovery. So when people stand up, they'll say things like, hi, my name is Chris and I'm a believer. So it's mimicking their, hi, my name is Chris and I'm a recovering addict. They have an opening gambit that they read out, which is very similar to a recovery meeting. Yeah. So, but it's got worship, it's got Bible teaching, it's got prayer ministry. So it feels like a recovery service, but it is church as well. So we pioneered that. RAF then, so that was a church plant essentially into our building. So that was our 3rd congregation by that point. And I approached Ralph and said, look, this is silly. You are planting congregations here. You need to be ordained. You need to be set free to do this. So he's just about to finish his training with me. He's been with me for 6 years. And the plan is now to plant with him and start other recovery services, essentially planting congregations around.
Through the recovery service.
Using recovery as a way of preaching the gospel, because all the language of recovery leads people to encounter God. You know, the higher power, they talk about it. But what do you mean by higher power? So like we're trying to help reframe that. So we've got recovery stuff. We've got our community centre, Fern Street. The church has grown. We planted churches. And then we've got the cafe that we're now sat in. We opened in 2024. And the idea was we're on this road.
So what was in here before?
Nothing. This was derelict land. There was a wall and everything here was just derelict concrete and weeds growing. This door here opened to nothing. There was nothing here. So this wall, there was no roof on it, and it was just dumping ground. Rubbish was here. Okay. So we said, right, let's rebuild the ancient ruins and do something here that turns the church from facing that way to facing this way, facing onto the highway. So now we have people walk down the road, they see the doors wide open, they come on in, they will walk through the door. We had somebody recently who walked in, she said, I need help. I'm 3 days clean.
Wow.
And we were able to say, we know exactly the person to speak to, and he's just around here. And yeah, so we've had women who've been in domestic violent relationships come and work in the cafe, get them a really good reference, and then we will
Is it hard to help these people and keep them in the context relationally that they're in? Do you know what I mean? Like some people would say, well, you need to get them out, they need to go somewhere else, they need distance from kind of that life, or how have you experienced that with these people?
There is a need sometimes to help people separate out, but the problem is if you send somebody to the coast to go get clean, they've not learned how to manage any of those relationships they're going to have to come back to, and they often relapse. Yeah. So
it's better for them to learn within the context that they're in.
We think so. Either you say like go away and stay away, or stay here where you've got your networks and we will hold you and create community to hold you. I'm just thinking of like Ephesus, which is probably a bad example, but have you had pushback from the drug industry in that sense because you're taking away clients? No, well, we have been burgled a few times. Maybe that was the dealer. No, I mean, the thing is, you get to know the dealers in the area. Yeah. And we have a number of folk who were dealers who've got clean and got themselves sorted. The thing is, in Tower Hamlets, you remove one dealer and 10 more appear. So that's not the problem. Yeah. And the problem is you remove one recovering addict, you run one addict off the street, another 10 will appear. So it's a never-ending problem. So nobody's ever been that concerned. But we do now have a team of people who are in recovery, who love the Lord, who go to recovery meetings around the neighborhood, and they talk about going fishing. I'm going fishing tonight. And they're going to recovery meetings to share their testimony. That's so cool. Knowing that in that room they can do that. Right. And they can't evangelize, but they can share their testimony. Their own story. Then people will ask, and they'll say, hey, why don't you come too? So we now have a meeting on a Monday night. Right. It's one of the more successful ones in Tower Hamlets. We've got the Tuesday night Father's House, which is Recovery Church, and Thursday nights is the Russian-speaking meeting. What's going on right now? That's going on right now. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah. So I'm hearing different themes through this. I'm hearing prayer and experiencing how, God's providence in that, of how you've prayed for things and phone calls just come in. Yeah. And then I'm hearing multiplication and reproduction. I'm hearing, like you said in the beginning already, you were looking for a place that is kind of poorer and people kind of pushed to the margins. Are all those things that you already carried within you? Yeah. Or would you say that have been kind of shaped in that? The key word for me is intentionality. So it seems to me those that are pushing for multiplication, reproduction, making things as simple as possible so they can be reproduced, that's people who are being intentional. A church that says, open the doors, let them turn up, they'll just come, and they'll learn the faith by osmosis. They come enough, they'll pick it up. They don't. People don't pick it up. Churches that say, I'm going to be intentional in discipleship, in mission, in leadership reproduction, but also intentional in saying, can we reproduce congregations? Can we plant a congregation? Can we plant a church? That's all about being intentional, isn't it? Like saying, I'm going to choose to make something happen. Kind of disciplinedly sticking to those kind of principles. Yeah. So has that been something you've just born with? Alan Hirsch. Come on, like shaping of things to come. So in was it 1998, 99? He wrote that the shaping of things to come. I was doing a missions essay at seminary. I was training to be a youth worker at the time. I was really interested in how we reached those that were missing from the church. So teenagers were a key thing for me. He wrote that book, Shaping of Things to Come. And as you look at all of his writing, right up until 2010 kind of stuff, it was all about being intentional in saying, how do you reproduce? How do you make leaders? How do you disciple? And how do you church plant? They're the threads and themes through all of his books, aren't they? So I read that stuff when I was at college, and that just then sits there. So then I become a youth worker in Birmingham, and I'm seeing possibilities of things. There was young people learning to skate, nobody teaching them. So I'm thinking, right, can I build a skate park to get young people to come to? Because if I can get them to come to the skate park, then there might be space for me to share the gospel. There was 21 young people came to faith one night, and then by the time we left, we had a youth congregation of about 100 young people in Birmingham. And it's that intentional choice of saying, right, how do I put myself in a place where, and who can I work with where we can reproduce, we can grow, we can multiply? So that was in me quite early on from what I was learning and reading. So I was ordained in the Church of England as we think it was the first pioneer minister. Nobody knew what that meant, and still don't really. But the idea was I was ordained to pioneer church in whatever form that was necessary for the mission field. And I did that for a number of years through youth ministry and church planting for teenagers. And I think all of that kind of pioneering literature that I was reading just fed into, if you're not being intentional, you're not going to do this. And therefore, when we came here, I was intentional in saying, how do I put together a plan of action that will get me from year 1 to year 5 so that I can actually head in the direction I want to be heading in? So I know, I've now got a building, I've got a congregation of 7, that's about it. So I know that I'm going to need to do some pieces of work to get me to the place where we are stable as a church, we've got financial income, but we're also then thinking about planting as well. So it was then being strategic in thinking that through. What's the building blocks, or what's the steps in that will get me to where I want to be?
Did you start off with the intentionality of saying we will reproduce congregation out of this? Did you went looking for the people to train, or did people come and you said, oh, we should probably send them? Like which way around did it happen?
I had no choice in multiplying. It was the deal I made with Rick Thorpe. So when he said, look, here's a church, we want to plant into it. And he said, the deal will be whatever we do to support you, you will then do it for others.
Now, are you doing the same thing with the people you're sending out?
Oh, yeah. Yes,
The deal continues.
Well, maybe not as heavy-handed, but I do say to them, you have to be thinking about reproduction. And you have to think about how do you multiply leadership, right? For what's appropriate for your neighborhood. And I'm so pleased because the last church plant we did was in the pandemic, and the guy leading it's doing an amazing job. And he's just had a woman get ordained, and she doesn't look like him. She's black, and she's from an African Caribbean background. And he's thinking really strategically about the needs of the neighborhood and what does representation look like and who's going to reach this neighborhood. So he's growing leaders that have often been overlooked. He's doing a great job.
So he's already thinking about reproduction of his congregation as well.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think it's a part of the HTB DNA as well. So I think to become a multiplying church, you need to have that sense of this is what we are doing. But I think you also need a movement to the side of you who are also saying, come on, you need to be doing.
Yeah.
Because on a Monday morning when you wake up and you're exhausted and you looked at your congregation the day before and only half of them turned up, and the big giver has just moved on, it's very easy to move out of multiplication mode into maintenance mode. And I think one of the things that I've really learned was, so in 2017, we did our first church plant. So it was after 7 years. But we sent our biggest givers, and I didn't know that's what we were doing. Sent our biggest givers. And we sent them in the autumn the year before. And then by Easter the following year, we could see we were going to hit bankruptcy by the summer. We were in free fall, our finances. I couldn't see. It was just declining at a rate that I thought, what's going on? We sent the biggest givers. And I really went into maintenance mode. How do I get back ground? I'm losing ground. How do I rebuild ground? And I really felt like I kept waking in the night, and as you do when you're trying to fix things yourself, you wake up and you worry, because worrying is praying to yourself. And I'd wake up and I'd worry and I'd worry. And the Lord got us through that year. By the end of the year, I don't know how it happened, there was no deficit at all.
Wow.
Can't tell you, I don't understand it. And I didn't want to understand it because I knew God had done something.
Right.
By the end of that year, I had to start talking that through with my mentor, because it did not do my mental health, my heart, or my sleeping any good. And he just challenged me, said, Chris, what happened was you went from multiplication to maintenance. That's okay for a season, but it's not okay going forward.
Wow.
I was like, you are so right. And I thought, right, I'm going to need to approach the next church plan, not going into maintenance, but continuing from multiplication. So I need to continue to multiply leaders. I need to multiply vision, even when we're planting over here. So I mean, some would say you've just gone through that devastating kind of experience, maybe to the church as well. I don't know how much they knew about the plummeting kind of. Oh, they do now, because we joke about the fact that
and then they're like,
I got really told off.
And then you're like, oh, let's multiply again, and everyone's like, do we really need to do that again? We've just done it.
And the second time round, I was a little bit more cautious in who we sent. I was just a little bit more strategic in thinking about who went and how we supported. But
you say the key when you multiply, or rather when you reproduce, is that you stick to multiplication and you don't go into maintenance mode.
Well, that worked for us the second time round, because it's not only does it work for the church, it does it work for you as the leader, so you don't lose your own soul in it. Because there's grief when you multiply as a church. You give away. You are going through grief, and grief is not a kingdom mentality. It's my kingdom mentality that I've lost. So I had to approach a lot of my own thinking about what we were doing. So the second time around, I felt like I was still being generous, but I was also planning for multiplication a year pre. So we knew the plant was going to happen in 2019. So in 2018, I'm working with Raf, talking to him about leadership, coaching him in congregational planting, so that when Dan moved on, I had Raf coming through. And the moment Dan then kind of stepped on to do his plant, we then had got energy to keep moving forward with this new person. And therefore, I felt like we'd let the planting team go, but we kept going ahead. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of moving forward. And I think for us, that meant that we felt like we didn't lose any momentum.
Right.
That we potentially felt like we lost in 2017.
So how organic does it happen? Do you have a pathway of planning, preparing, investing? You have like a pipeline, or is it simply, you know what I mean? It's like.
So I've got one guy that we're looking at planting with next year. I've got a guy a year behind him, which is quite close. It's just how it worked. We're looking at what we do with him in terms of planting as well. There's then a 2-year gap, and then there's a lady who's just training at the moment to be ordained that we've been working with for a number of years. So she's 2 years behind that. Then I've also got 2 other individuals that I'm working with in terms of coaching them towards church leadership, that I've got behind them, that I'm going right. So I've got a pipeline here that I'm working with, so that there's a new flow of leaders coming in.
Constantly bringing new people.
Yeah,
in.
and I think
And
it's that
are these people
intentionality.
on staff or?
No, so I mean, I'm going to use very Church of England language here. 2 are what you call curates. They've done their seminary training, and now they're in a 3-year apprenticeship program towards being a church leader of their own. So I've got 2 of those. I've then got this other lady, Hayley. She is now training at college. So she's in the training stage at the seminary. So I've got 2 out of seminary with me. I've got 1 in seminary with me. And so they're on the staff team. Hayley, who's now in the seminary training, she's part-time with me. The 2 that are behind her are just what we call lay members of the church. They're just people who serve the church amazingly well. And we are saying, why don't you come and walk with us for a while? Why don't you help host services with us? Why don't you run a ministry, and let's see how we might help you with that homeless outreach, or why don't you give preaching a go? So we're doing that testing the water stuff with them. So they're not on the staff team at all. We've also got a guy who's just got selected to train, but won't be training with us. We feel that actually we've got enough people here we're working with. Can we share him?
Right.
Can we give? So in a year's time, he'll be going to train at seminary, and the idea will be that he'll now be placed with another church.
Right.
So rather than just saying let's build up our own little pipeline,
Right.
actually there are times when you go, actually the pipeline. Can we be generous to people who actually would really be benefiting from somebody who's great, being with them and taking some of our DNA over there?
You were saying they're in seminary with you, I think was the language you used. Now, seminary, different forms, different places. This is intentionally tied to the local church context, though.
Yeah.
How does that, because not all seminaries work like that.
Yeah, so when I went to seminary, I went away.
Right.
And it was 3 years intensive in a room. And you wrote essays.
Yeah.
That didn't work for me.
Yeah.
And
I think it works for very few people.
Yeah, I struggled with that really. And I think as somebody who was new to faith, I needed some non-Christians around me. So I ended up getting a Saturday job in a photography shop just to meet non-Christians. And that's how I handled it. In London, we've got something called St. Mellitus, and it is an amazing way of training. You go to the college on a Monday. So you have lectures all day on Monday. And then every 4 or 5 weeks, you go away for a Friday and a Saturday. And then the rest of the week, you are placed with a leader who is expected to coach and to mentor, apprentice you. So the idea is you're doing theological reflection on a Monday, but then you're taking that into the week. And then you're spending time with a pastor in a church, and they're getting you ministry experience. And then you're writing journals off it, and theologically reflecting off it. And you have to do a dissertation. But that means that is in a locality.
Yeah.
So all of what we call them ordinands, they live in the locality, they're attached to a local church, intentionally there for 2 or 3 days a week, serving, and they're at the college a day or for a weekend. I think what this produces is people whose theology is grounded in the street. It's not theology that's grounded in the classroom where it doesn't quite add up.
Yeah.
So I remember when I was at college, some of the stuff I learned that sexuality, for example, you can come up with some really tight theology that works in the classroom, but when you're on the street and you meet somebody who is gay, does the theology in the classroom help you in that ministerial, missional relationship? And there were times where I felt, for me, that actually, I felt like I needed to play jazz with what I'd learned. So in jazz, you learn how to play the notes, but then you can riff it and you can...
Yeah.
And I felt like I was taking what I'd learned and I was now playing theological jazz when I met with people.
Yeah.
Not a great analogy, I'm sorry.
No.
But the guys that go to St. Mellitus, they're theologically reflecting on a Monday, and then on a Wednesday morning, they're meeting somebody who's in transition from he to she.
Yeah.
And suddenly you are meeting someone who needs the gospel, but also what they're going through might not match completely what you've been learning. So you're now theologically reflecting on the street.
Right.
That doesn't mean you're becoming liberal.
No.
But it does mean that your theology is now meeting the truth of people's lives.
Right.
And you have to start saying, how do I navigate this?
Yeah.
How does the gospel, how does Scripture
It's one thing for you to try to make sense of it yourself.
Yeah.
It's another thing to try to make sense of it for someone else.
Yeah.
And so you're learning to apply it within the immediate context that you're in.
I mean, I use that because that's a live topic, isn't it? But there were so many areas that I just felt that when I was at college, I left and thought, I'm not sure my theology is helping me in this missional situation right now.
I think my problem too in seminary was I was arguing the authors of books like written 20 years ago. And then you meet people in like discussion groups on like Christian faith and you realize the questions have changed.
Yeah.
And you don't know what to say. Or, you're preparing all the apologetics for atheists and then you meet agnostics because it's just a different, do you know, like, it's like the whole like science versus, like we were talking about briefly in the stuff, the whole science versus faith, right? And you're like, okay, like got it down. And you meet people and that's not at all what they're thinking anymore. And you realize, I didn't prepare for that.
I've come across...
I rarely meet atheists.
So I was talking to a youth worker yesterday who'd prepared a session with a group of non-Christian kids, or not yet Christian kids. And the session was on the woman at the well, because he felt that what a great story to show young people how amazing Jesus is. They read the story and he said, what do you think of that? And one of them said, well, I think it's really inappropriate. Single woman at a well, the man approaches her. He's a man in power. He's a rabbi, and he starts talking. I don't think it's appropriate. Safeguarding. And just how they read the story was from a 2024 heightened anxiety, distrust of authority.
Oh, interesting. I thought they would have pointed to the whole idea of like him kind of, it's inappropriate because he's pointing out her kind of like...
No, so the young people said, oh yeah, he's just mansplaining the gospel.
That's so good.
And I was like, do you know, this is interesting, isn't it? Because I read that story and I think, wow, isn't Jesus incredible? He's breaking down all these barriers. They read it and go...
Mansplaining.
Misogynistic. Man telling a woman what to do.
Masculinity.
Yeah. And you think, wow, yes. So you can't read exegesis from 20 years ago because it's
changed. Yeah,
it's the landscape has changed.
True.
So that really struck me. I thought, poor youth worker. I'm glad I'm not a youth worker anymore because I'm thinking there are other passages that I think, wow, how they'll interpret those.
So what would you say were the biggest challenges in multiplying and reproduction that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Maybe things that kind of hinder it.
The answer is not enough resources, because it frustrates me when people say, I would multiply more if I had. And I think it's actually multiplication is a mindset, not a resource thing. So if somebody says, we will multiply our church when we've got a congregation of, or when we've got the finances to. Now, I know that there are times when once you've hit a certain benchmark, then actually it's stable and you can then multiply because you're moving from a... But I think that's a challenge for us. We think we must have all of these things in place to multiply. I have experienced it's following the Spirit. And when we planted into Sugar House Island in 2019, Sugar House Island, it was purely because...
Best name ever.
It's a great name, isn't it?
It
was purely because I met a vicar in the urinals at a supermarket, and I said to the guy, I want to visit your church in a few weeks, I'm on sabbatical. And he said, oh, I'd love to have a coffee with you because this is all happening at the urinals and washing our hands. There's an estate that's in between both of our churches that has no church presence on it, and I'd love your help to plant onto it. And I said, do you know what? I've got a guy who could plant, but I just hadn't started praying yet about where we would go. And that became a great relationship, all because we had a conversation at a urinal. And it was the reason we planted the first time was we got 3 prophetic pictures about buses and the need to watch the buses with these prophetic pictures. And somebody who said, have you noticed, Chris, the bus goes from outside church all the way to Canning Town? So I looked, and he's right, the bus here goes all the way to Canning Town. And that afternoon I got an email from a vicar who said, I'm retiring from a church in Canning Town. I have a congregation of 3. If you ever want to plant into it, give the bishop an email. And it's the Spirit.
That's crazy.
So I would say multiplication for me has been led by the Spirit.
Responding to what
the Spirit taking us on that, rather than, and I've said it's about being intentional, but for me it's been intentional in listening to the Spirit and paying attention to the Spirit that has led us to multiplication.
Okay. Practical tips and hacks for you for how to do that.
How to be intentionally listening to God's
Spirit towards multiplication.
Oh, I wish I could know how to bottle that. I think it is about choosing to look for the ways the Spirit is speaking that might not be. So for us, there was 3 prophetic.
But the interesting thing is you're looking for the ways that the Spirit is speaking in the kingdom expansion perspective.
Yeah.
You're not just looking for the way the Spirit is speaking in confirming what you're maintaining, right? But you're actually listening. What is the Spirit saying about multiplication?
Yes.
That's a very different question to ask, and maybe we don't hear those answers because we're not asking those questions.
A church leader has to be doing 2 things at once, I think. You are looking at your flock,
right?
But you're also looking at where there needs to be a flock.
Yeah.
And I think some of us, we are so caught up with what we're doing in front of us in the church that we've not got our head up to just be looking around to see where there needs to be, further help. So for me, in saying I want to listen to what the Spirit is saying, is about me saying, Lord, I don't want to hold on to anything here if you've got a plan over there. And my call is to multiply your kingdom, not to multiply my church.
Right.
So, Lord, I'm watching my sheep, but I'm also being attentive to looking around to just see where there are opportunities might come up.
Right.
And, just this summer, we've had some very early conversations with somebody. I was at a conference and I just felt like the Lord said, you need to have coffee with that particular person. So I did. It's a local church leader who was also at the conference, and he just said, Chris, there's this opportunity emerging, but we're going to need somebody to lead into that plan. And what he's described matches my planter to a T. So we said, right, let's talk about it. Let's see if this is the Lord, or let's just see if this is an opportunity. Because sometimes you plant out of opportunities, but I'd rather plant out of an opportunity that is the Lord. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Not every opportunity is the Lord's opportunity.
No, and that's not so. But that doesn't mean that I think we shouldn't be planting when we see opportunities. But I'm interested in saying, can we plant out of what the Lord is saying? So, for me, it's just that praying and saying, Lord, right, I'm moving into a new season now where we're looking again onto the further landscape about what you're doing, where the gaps are. So we've just got the antennas up, Lord, to however you want to speak in that.
Are just all churches around London doing this?
No, I think.
And what would you say why? Like as Exponential Europe, we're saying we want this actually to be the norm. For this to be normal.
Yes.
That no one needs to do a podcast talking about it, but because why are we talking about eating lunch? People do that. What do you think is the hindering factors of why it's not normal?
We have to recognize that it's not taught. Many traditions of church are not teaching their pastors on this. We're teaching them to be pastor shepherds and teaching pastors in the locality. We're not teaching them about anything further afield. So I think there's something like teaching and saying, we've all got the responsibility to have prophetic imaginations, to see multiplication options. We've all got that. But I think it's teaching people to to be able to move that as a language that they move in, rather than just an idea that they can see at a conference. It's actually, this is what we're going to move in. So I think something about teaching. I think there's also, where you see things shrinking, you do move into maintenance. And I don't think we're helping people who are in that place of maintenance move into multiplication. We're either letting them get on with it and saying, well, their churches are dying, so we'll leave them to it. And when that church is dead, we'll plant it into it. We could shift that and say, well, let's save 10 years. What can we do to help this church leader become a multiplying church leader? Well, one of the options is you take somebody you've trained up and you put them there. So one of the things that I'm thinking about is, rather than saying we could plant another church, could we take one of our leaders who is thinking in terms of multiplication and say, right, I'm going to put you with this church leader over here. Will you work with them for them to kind of gain some of that multiplication energy, the excitement around it? If they could just see a bit of growth, they're going to change. It's because they're in this fear mentality, and therefore can I put somebody with them? So you're not saying get rid of them, but you're saying, actually, some of these amazing church leaders who are in their 50s and 60s, what they've got to offer is like, it's wisdom.
Yeah.
But they don't have the energy anymore for that multiplication. So let's put some energy with them. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about is how do you do that? How could you put people? So it's educational. I think there's something about partnerships that we've not really explored yet, because it's about me building my congregation, growing leaders, and me planting. That's the model the evangelical church has been in. And I think if we can start saying, well, let's work across.
How do we multiply collaboratively?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not just one mother church and one daughter church. Maybe it's coming out of different congregations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it becomes networks of working together for multiplication. Yeah. And I think if you said what's been the major win with HTB, it has been through a common desire to work together across the boundaries. And there's so many church plants that have happened where a team has come from one church, but the planter has come from the other. Or the resources have come, financial resources from one church, but the planters come from another. And therefore, both churches have got ownership, the excitement for that thing. So it's multiplication where it's
owned by several parties. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've seen as major wins, is when that's happened. So there's a great church not far from here, Christchurch Spitalfields, and they were revitalized about 8-9 years ago because two churches sent two young church leaders there together to pioneer an evening congregation. The evening congregation grew, it was bigger than the morning congregation. And then the pastor that was there at the time said, wow, you guys are, you are doing something here. Let me step out of the way, take over. And actually now one of the planters is now leading the entire church. The other one has gone on to do it again. But it was through two churches sending two young guys to work together to revitalize the third church. And those two churches wanting nothing back other than tell us the stories.
Yeah.
And that's the generosity of the kingdom, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the idea that multiplication happens in kind of the surplus of finance. So the surplus of we just have so much money left over, we don't know what to do with it. I guess we can plant a church, or we have so many leaders that we don't know what to do with them. I guess I think that's just it. Very rarely happens like that. It's like you said. It is the intentionality that we will go through the quote unquote loss, because it's not really loss, because it's a gain and a win for the kingdom, even though it is we're losing people, but it's a continuation of a movement, right?
Can I say what you just said there is probably going to be my third point. It was around this the idea of intentionality rather than osmosis. So I think one of the reasons why churches aren't multiplying is they really think that if people just showed up on a Sunday, then it'll just happen. And it doesn't. And I think it's moving church leaders from this, what I call the osmosis mindset. If they just, we sit here, they'll come along, to being intentional in saying, right, how do we go from 30 members to 50? What are we going to need to do to get there? Is it we're just going to put a flyer through everybody's door in the neighborhood, or we're going to run an alpha course? It's choosing to intentionally put new things in place so there's the potential of that new growth. And I think that is the piece that many church leaders don't have. Intentional desire to grow. They're living out of a fear, we're shrinking, oh no, I'm not doing a good job. And you can see the confidence has gone. Whereas the church leaders who have been intentional are seeing that growth. So I was just today speaking at something on how to move towards becoming intentional as a church leader in your discipleship, in your leadership, in your multiplication. How do you move towards that? Because if we can help a church leader who's peaked in their energy and they've had their best years behind them, but we can get them to move towards being intentional, actually they can have another curve.
Right.
There's another season ahead if you could move towards being intentional again.
At the end of each episode, we want to encourage our listeners, very much in alignment with what you were talking about already, is to just take a couple of minutes of prayer. What would you ask them to pray about? And it could be for what's happening around here, but maybe also for them and the intentionality in their life. But I don't know how you want to tie it into just inviting them into a space of prayer after this episode.
I think it's about praying for Dave Ferguson's book, The Hero Maker. Becoming a leader that creates leaders and praying for the next generation of leaders and praying for who's going to be the next person you invest into. For me, that's a core thing that's on my mind right now. And partly since the conference, like we had the conference in Berlin, Exponential conference in Berlin in the autumn last year. And, since then, it's just been on my mind. I know it was the theme of the conference, so it's going to sit on my mind, isn't it? But the key thing was, who is it you are going to grow as a leader? And for me, that's just become the heartbeat of the prayer for my church. Lord, are there people here that I am not seeing yet, that you are really wanting me to spot, that I've not given them a time of day, but you have placed a call on their life and I've not seen it, but I want to see it so I can be part of seeing them grow? I think that's been my prayer, and that's what I'd love other leaders to be praying into.
Yeah.
Because it's too easy to pray, God, multiply my church. It's too easy to pray, Lord, there's a deficit.
Lord, you do it.
You do it, Lord.
But rather, Lord, what are you doing? And you're inviting me into that.
How can I see what you see? Who should I be seeing? And I think that's been my intentional prayer since coming back from Berlin.
What did you say? Prophetic imagination. I like that. What I love for all the things that you've shared is it always felt like you were moving into spaces that the Lord was already moving in. The Spirit was already there. You're looking for people that God is wanting to do something. Like you've just, it's a posture of following into, because we're following a Lord that is on the move, right? Christ is moving, and we're just trying to keep up. But
it's also, the foolishness is, God bless what I'm doing.
Right. Yeah.
Wisdom is, Lord, what are you doing? How can I work with you? You're going to be doing this in 100, 200, 300 years' time.
Yeah.
Look, how do I partner with you in what you're doing, Lord? And I think I learned that the hard way.
I appreciate that. So I just want to encourage you listeners, take some time to pray for that. Who is God wanting you to invest into in your sphere of leadership and influence? Thank you so much, Cris.
Pleasure.